If you've ever been to Niagara Falls and been to one of those old buildings on the main street there that have some of the history of the falls, you've undoubtedly seen a picture of Charles Blodin. 1859, French acrobat, and he stuns the world. He has thousands and thousands of people lining the gorge to watch him as he walks a tightrope from one side to the other. It's 1,100 feet long, 160 feet off the bottom of the roaring falls. Again, thousands were there to watch him, not cross just once, but he crossed many times. He crossed it blindfolded. He crossed it carrying somebody on his shoulders. He crossed it even stopping in the middle to make an omelet to cook there. And there's pictures, 1859. Here's the thing, Blondin had mastered the art of living dangerously while making it look easy. And he would balance there and everyone ooh and ah, but he knew exactly what he was doing. In his mind, he was safe. But he had mastered living dangerously and making it look easy. The Jews that are in exile in Persia at the time of Esther that we're now starting to look at were very much on their own tightrope. I don't know if you realize that, but they were. It had been 70 years since Persia had come in and defeated Babylon, and the great King Cyrus, he said, go back, build the temple, rebuild Jerusalem. I'll even provide you all the money. And yet, so much of the Jewish people had stayed in captivity in Persia. They'd built lives for themselves, comfortable lives. They had learned the language, had grown up there, had prosperous businesses. Many of them had even been born there. So there was not necessarily any natural connection or compulsion to go back to the promised land that God had given them. And like Blodin on his tightrope, they had learned to balance between two worlds. They were Jews who supposedly followed God, and yet at the same time, they were in the Persian Empire acting as Persians. They managed somehow to keep that Jewish identity and yet live in the Persian world. But here's the thing about tightropes. They're safe until they're not, right? One wrong step, one little gust of wind, one moment of overconfidence, and everything changes and you plunge. The Jews who stayed in Persia were about to discover just how quickly comfort can change to catastrophe. But before we dive into Esther too far, here in chapter 1, we need to understand what kind of a book Esther is. It's a historical, it's an Old Testament narrative, but it's not your typical narrative. It's very much a divine comedy, and I mean that in the literal sense. Because as we look and study it, the author wants us to see the absolute absurdity of it all. Kings who can't control their wives, counselors who overreact to domestic situations, and decrees that go out that can never be changed, supposedly. How foolish is all of this? And yet, underneath all of this that's going on, there is something profound that's leading it all. It's the theme of reversals. We're going to see that throughout Esther, there is this working hand of God behind all things. We're going to see the high brought low and the low brought high. We're going to see the hunter become the hunted. And we're going to see the condemned man become celebrated. Reversals are God's plot twist throughout the Old Testament, but very much so in Esther, they rise right to the top. And here's what's remarkable. God's name is never mentioned once in Esther, right? You can read it through time and time again, and you will not see it in Scripture. But his fingerprints are on every page of the story. He is actively working in and behind to bring about his purposes. He's the unseen director orchestrating all of the events, the hidden hand who is moving all of the chess pieces on the board of history. He's working through the actions of people, the intentions of people, even the very personalities, their predilections to things. He is working through all of these things to bring about his good and wonderful purposes. So as we start to read chapter 1, we're really asking the big question that is haunting all of the exiles and haunting every one of us who understand that we are exiles here as well. Is God still faithful to his covenant promises, even when his people have chosen comfort over calling? Let me say that again. Is God still faithful to his covenant promises, even when his people have chosen comfort over calling? That's the big question that's there. They have not returned to the promised land. Is God still going to be faithful? Okay, so let's put that aside and start now in verses 1 and following to verse 8. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of its reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and his servants. I don't know if you caught it, but right in those first sentences, the author wants us to smile. Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus, this great and mighty king. How many Ahasueruses are in the history of man? This is the only one that's ever recorded with that name. This person in history we know as Xerxes I. He's one of the most powerful rulers of the day. He commands an empire that stretches from India to Ethiopia. But the way he's introduced with this long, tongue-twisting name is almost comical. And what does the emperor do with all of this power? He throws a party. And not just any party, a 180-day extravaganza of drunkenness. 6 months of feasting. Can you imagine the logistics? Can you imagine the cost, the sheer excess that is being displayed in all of this? And here's what's really happening behind the scenes, if you know your history at all. Ahasuerus is going to war against Greece. And there was a movie came out a couple years ago called The 300. So 300 Athenians actually repelled the whole Persian army. This is what Ahasuerus is going to. He's going to war against the 300, and he doesn't know it yet. But he needs his royal officials. He needs their money. He needs their resources. He needs their troops. So he's putting on this massive display of wealth and power. Essentially, he's saying, look at me. Look how wonderful I am. Look how magnificent and generous I am. Don't you want to be on my side in a couple months when everything comes on and we bring all of this booty? Surely you want to support this war with me. Well, the verses go on to actually describe the opulence of everything that's going on in this time of feasting. Listen to it again. White cotton curtains with violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple, to silver rods and marble pillars, and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. It's kind of the most gaudy Hollywood experience you could ever imagine. And then in verse 8, notice what it says, and drinking was according to the edict. There shall be no compulsion. Look how gracious I am. Look how magnanimous I am. The king's not forcing anybody to eat. What a benevolent ruler to have. He has this feast and you could partake to your heart's desire. But as we look at all of that, we need to be asking one question. Is this how a good king should act? Is this how any political leader should act? 6 months of partying and preparing for war by buying the loyalty with having this elaborate, splashed out display of wealth. Now, for the Jews who are living and observing all of this, life in Persia was pretty good. You're living inside the strongest empire. You've got security. You've got a king who could be very generous at times. It was an empire who was prosperous. You could start a business and you could grow. Your future seemed secure. So why would you ever want to go back to Jerusalem and put in a hard day's labor rebuilding it? And in fact, they knew from the information that even with 70 years of being there, the ones who had gone back under Ezra and Nehemiah, what they had been able to create was paled in comparison. So if it's only a shadow of the glory that it used to be, and I have to put in my sweat, I'm going to stay here in Persia under this strong kingdom, and I'm going to enjoy life. But starting in verses 9 through 12, the mask starts to come off. Queen Vashti also has her own feast for the palace workers. And on the 7th day, when the king's heart was merry, meaning he was drunk as a skunk, he commanded Queen Vashti to be paraded before everyone in her royal crown. Why? Because he wanted everybody to see how beautiful the queen was. But Queen Vashti refused to be summoned. She refused to be put on display. She refused to be a pawn in this group of drunken, lecherous leaders. And so she said no. And immediately the king became enraged. He burned with anger. And here's where the comedy starts to turn dark. 7 days of drinking at the end of this 6 months of drinking, 7 more days, and the king decides he wants to show the most prized possession that he has, his beautiful wife. Vashti, come on out. Wear your crown. I want everyone to see how gorgeous you are. Now, there's a lot of debate throughout history as to what that means. There's a lot of people, and myself included, that would lean towards the fact that he's actually asking her to come out naked and wear only her crown. Can you imagine how humiliating and demeaning that would have been? But even if she wasn't, even if she was arrayed in all of these beautiful clothes with the crown, she is still being treated as chattel, as a possession that could be put on display and then put away again. Vashti was a queen. She wasn't a trophy to be prepared or to be paraded in this group of drunken and lecherous men. So she says no. Now, I can't imagine how quiet that room must have got. It wouldn't have been all at once, but the ones who saw her rebel and say no, it just would have slowly, table by table, it would have gotten deadly quiet. You would have heard a pin. The most powerful man in the world, he rules this huge empire. He actually commands millions of subjects. He's just being publicly defied and humiliated by his own wife. And what's his response? He becomes angered. Rage builds up and burns inside him. This is the man who has just spent 6 months showing how gracious he is, how wonderful he is, how self-controlled he is, how generous he is. And when his authority is challenged by a woman, he becomes enraged. And we see that character underneath coming out. We see his true character emerge. And here's what we're supposed to see in the development of this scene here. Worldly power is unpredictable. It's fickle, it's capricious. It changes from one moment to the next, depending on the attitude and the feelings of the leader himself. Worldly power is driven by ego. Worldly power is impaired by excess. Worldly power quickly becomes anger when it's challenged. The king who seemed so gracious and loving and kind for 6 months is actually, he's petty. He's vindictive, and he's unstable. All of this is meant to make us think about what is the nature of earthly authority. How often do we see political leaders who represent themselves as reasonable, as measured, as wanting the good for everyone, only to reveal their true nature when they get crossed? How often do we see good men and women in leadership who are turned by wealth and power and become corrupt? Now we come to verses 13 through 22, and the comedy becomes even more absurd. Listen. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of the king Ahasuerus? Notice what's just happened. He's so rattled at his wife's disobedience, he can't even think straight. So he goes to his brain trust. He goes to seers and astrologers and those who know the law, and he asks them, what am I to do? And one man in particular, Memucan, he's just dying. He sees this as a personal challenge as well. He says, Vashti's not only insulted the king, she's insulted everybody at this feast, every leader who's here. And if any other woman in the empire hears about her disobedience and how she is not punished if we don't do something, it's going to cause them to disrespect their husbands. They're going to show contempt to their husbands as well. As you're listening to Memucan, you can almost hear the hysteria in his voice. Maybe he has a troubled marriage and he can't deal with his wife, but there's hysteria there. And the idea is that one woman's refusal to be objectified, it's going to bring down the empire. Every woman in the kingdom is suddenly going to rebel. The social order that has been there for 80 years is going to collapse, and the kingdom is gone. It's ridiculous, isn't it? And we're meant to see it as ridiculous. These powerful men are so insecure, so threatened by one woman's dignity that she is not going to be defiled in this way, that they convince themselves that the fate of the empire is in the balance, and they need to do something about it. So what do? They make a law. Let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Medes and the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. There's a tragic irony here. According to Esther, the book of Esther, Persian law is irrevocable. It's by its very nature unchangeable. You can't take it back again. So the very rule of law is supposed to provide stability. It's supposed to provide constancy. It's supposed to provide order. But this law is born out of what? It's born out of wounded pride. It's born out of drunken anger. And it'll be the trap that actually Haman manipulates the king with in a couple chapters. And it signs another irreversible order that's going to put the life of every Jew in the empire at threat. And you notice the scope of their overreaction. He sends the proclamation out through all of the empire, from India, all the way out. And he demands that every woman, slave or free, honor their husbands. He's to rule the house. When Vashti refuses, his pride, his honor are so wounded that he sends out this decree to the very four corners of the empire in dozens of languages, so that anyone who spoke a different language within the empire bounds could read it for themselves in their own tongue and understand the fullness of this law. Would a good king act this way? First of all, would he demand an indignity of his queen? Second of all, would he act so rashly and so poorly? It's almost too absurd to believe. Except we see this kind of overreach all the time, even today, don't we? Leaders making sweeping policies based on personal grievances, wounded pride and embarrassment, using the power of the state to serve personal ends. Now, as we go through Esther for the next 3 months, we're going to try to be Christ-centered each time, and we're going to go back to some principles we learned 3 years ago when we looked through the book of Ecclesiastes. There are 6 different ways to be able to legitimately come to Christ in the Old Testament, to know for sure that we are getting a Christ-centered message out of it. And we're going to be looking this morning at the theme of king or kingship, but we're really going to be focusing on one that is even more evident. They're not mutually exclusive, but the one that we're going to extrude everything through is the way of contrast. And when I say contrast, what I mean is that, what does this tell us about God and Jesus, even if God's name's not here? By comparing the failures of this king, of earthly kings, and the perfection of God's kingdom, it's a stark contrast, isn't it? In fact, I don't know if there can be a starker contrast in the Bible than this. We look at Ahasuerus. He rules through opulent displays of wealth and power. He tries to buy loyalty with lavish parties. His judgment is impaired by alcohol and his ego. He's quick to anger. He makes rash decisions. He's easily manipulated by the counselors. His laws, supposedly unchangeable, are actually driven by petty personal grievances. He's hurt and he's lashing out. Now contrast that with what we know about Christ's kingship. Jesus didn't come with pomp and circumstance, did he? He came, he was born in the lowliness of a manger. He didn't throw vast parties to win followers. He served them. He healed them. He taught them. He even washed the disciples' feet. Jesus wasn't quick to anger. In fact, he was slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. His decisions were not rash. They were deliberate, wise, and always motivated by love for his people. When earthly rulers are challenged, they lash out. When Jesus was challenged, when he was mocked, when he was crucified, what did he do? He prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And here's the really sobering thought for us this morning. We've never lived under a king like Ahasuerus. But we've seen these patterns in our modern politics today, haven't we? Leaders who govern through pomp and ceremony, self-promotion, politicians who make decisions based on personal grievances rather than wisdom, officials whose judgment is impaired by their own ego, their own hubris, and the echo chamber of the sycophants is the word that they use these days, of those who are supporting him, that are around him. You know, it wasn't that long ago, only a couple years ago. Now, if we had read this chapter, we would have thought, no way this could ever happen in the West. Impossible. And yet, it's unfolding right before our eyes. It's on the news every night, isn't it? We've watched as comfortable situations turn dangerous or deadly. As leaders who seemed reasonable reveal their true nature under pressure. As laws, stability, and normality are supposed to be brought by the law, actually prove to be much more fragile than we could ever have thought. Our democracy is here, and it's in stone. Nothing can change that. Oops, it just did. And the question for us is, how do we live faithfully when earthly authority is so unreliable, when it's so fickle, when it's so capricious? How do we maintain our integrity in a culture around us that rewards compromise? Well, here's where the book of Esther should get really uncomfortable for us. Because we're going to see that the protagonist, we're going to see that the leading protagonists here, Mordecai and Esther, are not models. They're not pillars of faithfulness. Their actions, their everyday actions, are actually morally ambiguous. Especially next week, we're just going to shake our heads. You know, what made this young girl to think she could do this? Mordecai and Esther have become accustomed to themselves in the Persian culture. They've taken on Persian names. They participate in Persian customs. It looks like Mordecai himself is actually part of the greater court system. They've become quite comfortable, thank you very much, in the exile. When we first meet them, they're not crying out to God for deliverance. They're not longing to return to Jerusalem. They have made their peace to live in a foreign land under a fickle king. In many ways, they're just like all of the other Jews who had not gone back, who had stayed in Persia, didn't go back with Ezra and Nehemiah. And what makes it uncomfortable for us is that we see ourselves in them, or we should see ourselves in them. How many of us have become so comfortable in the world and the culture around us that we just bring in everything without any thought, without any thinking about how that must change our life? In many ways, we've lost what we could call our prophetic edge. We are not yearning and leaning towards glory anymore. We've become more comfortable in the horizon here in this culture. And how many of us have become accommodated to this world, its norms, instead of standing forth for the biblical values which we know glorify God? We live in our own kind of Persia, a culture that can be generous and tolerant on one day, but hostile and oppressive on another. Don't get me wrong, we enjoy the benefits of living here. There are economic benefits, there are religious freedom, we have personal freedoms, but also this culture can change quickly. Tolerance, which may be here one day, may vanish as the mist in the morning the next. Just like the Jews in the day of Esther, We live in a day and age when God isn't speaking supernaturally in extraordinary ways. And many of us, even if we walk by faith and we're Christians, he just sometimes feels distant, doesn't he? He feels aloof. So the big question is, how do we live? Well, let me suggest 3 principles. First of all, we must remember that our ultimate citizenship is in heaven. Like the Jews in Persia, we're exiles here. This is not our home. And we've looked at this sojourner aspect over the last year, but I guess the question is, has any of it sunk in? Because we come to Esther and it's right there in the front again. We can engage the culture, we can even benefit from the culture, but we must never let it define us. We must never let it bring a conformity to the way we live. If we know what glorifies God, then we must walk in that manner. The second is prepare. One day that tightrope could just snap. The reality is the Jews in Persia had learned to live comfortably, but they were now finding that that comfort can turn to crisis overnight. And I think that's one of the things that has become so evident recently. We see it working out. Our culture can change radically from one week to another depending on who's leading. So we need to be spiritually and we need to be practically prepared, because the time will come, our faith will be tested, and we need to be prepared to stand and pay the cost for truth. Third, we must trust in God's hidden providence. Even if we can't see his hand at work, even when his people are unfaithful, even when earthly rulers seem to be in control and yet so out of control at the same time, God is still working out his good promises. He's still faithful even when we are not faithful. He will keep his promises. And that brings us really to the most important truth in this passage, that God is already at work in chapter 1. We don't see his name, but we should be able to see his fingerprints on everything that's going on. Think about it. Ahasuerus' drunken demand leads to Vashti's removal. She's taken out of court. And that in turn creates the open spot for Esther to become queen. The king's wounded pride and the counselor's overreaction, it all sets in motion the very circumstances that allow God to be able to save his people in 2 or 3 chapters. So God, he doesn't cause sin. Ahasuerus chose to get drunk. He chose to objectify Vashti. He chose to listen to bad counsel. But God uses even their sinful choices to accomplish his purposes. He's worked through their temperaments. He's worked through their weaknesses. He's worked through their flawed decisions to position his people exactly where they need to be so that he can bring salvation. This is what theologians call providence. God sovereignly in control of all things, working through even human sin and failure to accomplish his good purposes. When we watch as comfortable situations radically change overnight to become dangerous because world leaders wield power unpredictably, they make impulsive and foolish decisions that hurt thousands or millions. When they demand unwavering obedience, hold ostentatious parties and displays of wealth for their own glory, we need to remember that God is in control. We need to remember what's going on in Esther chapter 1. God is still working, even if we can't see him. He's still faithful, even when his people are not. He's still sovereign, even when the earthly rulers seem to have all the power. The question isn't whether God will keep his covenant commitments. He will. The question is whether we're going to trust him when we can't see his hand at work in the world around us, and all we see is this confusion and this chaos. The question is whether we're going to remain faithful when the culture demands that we compromise. Earthly kingdoms will rise and fall, but God's kingdom endures forever. And that brings us to why this passage is so perfect for the third Sunday of Advent. And an example of God's providence, because I put this in place probably 3 or 4 months ago. But as I was writing yesterday, I thought, Lord, thank you for your divine hand in moving this. Because we live in a time that's not so different from Esther, don't we? We're exiles in a foreign land. We live under earthly rulers who are flawed, fallible, sinful, and at some times just downright evil. We've seen it in real life, how quick things can change, how predictable, how fickle human authority can be. But Advent reminds us that we are waiting for a different kind of king. Not one who rules through displays of power and wealth, but one who has come in humility. Not one whose judgment is impaired by pride or alcohol, but one whose wisdom is perfect. Not one who makes rash decisions and based on his wounded ego, but one whose every action flows from perfect love. Jesus is the king who doesn't need to provide proof of his authority, because you just have to look at his character and his nature. He doesn't need to buy loyalty through lavish gifts. He wins our heart through his sacrificial death, his love toward us. He doesn't lash out when he's challenged. He laid down his life for us. And here's the promise of Advent. He's coming back. When we light these candles, we often think that, we're simply looking back to the birth, and that's true. That's a wonderful thing, the most monumental thing in human history so far. But when we light this candle, we are remembering that there is a greater king yet to come. And it breaks up our involvement in the culture around us, and it fixes our heart and should mean that we lean forward in hope and the expectancy, come, Lord Jesus, even today. The king who was born in Bethlehem, who died on Calvary, who rose from the dead, he's coming back to establish his kingdom in all of its fullness and in all of its glory. And he's going to rule with perfect righteousness and justice. It will stream like a mighty waters, a kingdom where the proud will be laid low and the low will be brought high, a kingdom where every tear will be brushed away and every wrong made right. Until that day, we live here in our own Persia, exiles in a foreign land, trusting in God's hidden providence, remaining faithful, and not succumb to the pressures of our culture around us. We engage the world, but we never forget that our ultimate allegiance belongs to our coming King. So as we remember Advent this third week, let us rejoice. Earthly kingdoms will fall away. Earthly rulers will come and go. But our God reigns forever. His kingdom has no end. His authority will never fail. And his promises will never falter. Heavenly Father, we thank you that even when your name isn't mentioned, your presence is so evident. Even when your people are unfaithful, you remain faithful. Even when earthly rulers fail, you still reign. Help us to live as faithful exiles in this world, engaging with the culture around us, but never compromising our core convictions. Give us wisdom to navigate the complexities of living under imperfect human authority while maintaining our ultimate allegiance to you. When comfort turns to crisis, when that tightrope wants to snap, when we can't see your hand at work, help us to trust in your hidden providence. Remind us that you're still writing the story, still working through all things to bring them to your perfect good, still faithful in all of your covenant promises. And as we wait for the coming of our true King, fill our hearts with hope. Bring us to long for the kingdom, to live for your values, and to point others to the perfect rule of Jesus Christ. In his precious name we pray. Amen.